Yeah, so I'm going to introduce this quite remarkable diary, which was kept by a Belgian painter, Antoine-Auguste-Joseph Payen, was born in Brussels in 1792 and died in Tournai, Doornik, in 1853. He was probably the most accomplished Western artist to visit Indonesia, to visit the Netherlands Indies, then the Netherlands Indies in the early 19th century. He was also an architect, and that's why he becomes part of our story. So he was born in Brussels. He studied at the Collège des Beaux-Arts, the College of Fine Art, and his father was an architect and also an artist in his own right. So he came from a gifted family of artists. And in 1816, he sailed for the Indies. He's arrived in 1817, and he was part of the Reinwarth Commission. Professor C.G.C. Reinwarth was a Prussian botanist, professor of botany, and he was recruited by the Dutch. He was actually recruited by the Dutch to write a new and better history of Java than Raffles had done. He didn't do that, but he did set up the Botanic Garden in Bogor, and he had a team which was tasked with recording the fauna and flora of Java, particularly West Java. And Payen was part of that team between 1817 and 1821 when Reinwarth returned to Europe and became a professor in Leiden. Payen is tasked with a very important role, along with other artists like the Big brothers, Adrian Johannes Beek and his brother Theodorus Janus Beek. And he serves on the Reinwarth Commission up to the early 1820s. And one of his pupils is the Wunderkind, a genius, Indonesian artist, Arab Javanese artist from Semarang, from Torboyo, Raden Saleh Sharif Bustaman, he was born in 1811, so he came under the aegis of Payen in about 1820, when he was 8 to 9 years old. Yeah. So this man, who you see in the middle here, is a very interesting figure. And he happens to be very important for history because he was in Jogja at the time of the outbreak of the Java War. And he reported on what he saw in Jogja when the war broke out. He was in Jogja because on the 27th of June, he was tasked by the Department of Engineering, Military Engineering, to proceed to Jogja from Bandung, where his residence was, after he finished in Bogor with the Reinwarth Commission. And he proceeded along the coast. On the 28th of June, he reached Tegal. And on the 29th to the 30th of June, he began to enter the princely territories. His axle broke on his carriage, so he had to wait and go back to Semarang to get a new carriage. But he arrived in Jogja on the 1st of July. And he stayed with the assistant resident, Pierre-Frédéric Henri Chevalier, and they obviously corresponded in French. And he stayed with him at Rojowenangun, which was a royal estate, to the east of Jogja. And while he was staying with Chevalier, the Java War broke out. So in Payen's diary, blow by blow, we can see the sort of build-up to the Java War and the stupidity of the Dutch resident, Anthony Hendrik Smissaert, in terms of tasking Diponegoro's uncle, Pangeran Mangkubumi, with bringing his nephew over to the Dutch and being threatened with all sorts of consequences if he didn't. So we have an insider's view of what's going on in the pretty discombobulated and scatterbrained Dutch administration in Jogja. And particularly because of Chevalier, who's just made these long tours of the interior in the western outlying provinces, the western Montenegro to Banyumas and Bagalen, we have a very close insight into what the situation is in the countryside, with the Chinese toll gatekeepers, with the sort of collapse of the village economy because of the very deleterious and very baneful effects of these toll gates, the Bandar Toll, and the blow-by-blow account of how the war breaks out, how Diponegoro's dalam, his residence at Tegalrejo, is torched on Wednesday the 20th of July, 1825, and the following day, on Thursday the 21st of July, when he sets up the standard of revolt in Selarong, which is his meditation cave in Bantul to the south of Jogja, where he makes his first headquarters. Yeah, so we see the outbreak of the Java War through the eyes of not a colonial official, not even a Dutchman. He's Belgian, and he has a very critical relationship with the Dutch and the way in which they conduct their colonial business is very critical. And we see it also through the eyes of an artist, because he can vividly, such as the midnight exit of the Sultan from the Vredenburg, the Dutch fort, just illuminated by candles, a little boy Sultan, still a baby really, a toddler, 3 years old, crying his eyes out because he doesn't want to be in the Dutch fort and wants to go back to the court. And also the very brutal situation which is there in Jogja, with people dying of starvation, as it is essentially encircled by Diponegoro's troops for the best part of 3 months. Payen is in Jogja from the 1st of June through to the 25th of September. And the diary covers his experience of those months. And they are very, very vivid, brutal. I mean, he sees people who are called santri, sort of terrorists, a synonym for terrorist, santri, being beaten to death in the barracks and by soldiers and by garrison forces. And the nonchalance of Smissaert in terms of having these big parties with bands and orchestras, serenading his gluttonous eating, while the population of the court and the court city are undergoing the privations of starvation. And what it's like, nous avons entendu dire, we heard say, these are all rumors, yeah, that de Kock, the Panglima, the Supremo, military Supremo, had reached Solo on the 30th of July, had stabilized the court, which was about to join the Solo court, the Kesunanan Diponegoro, and eventually got together sufficient military assets to bring a 4,000-strong armored column from Solo, via Klaten, to Jogja to relieve the Sultan, the capital of the Sultanate, in late September. The first squadrons of this armored column reach Jogja on the 18th of September, and Payen is able eventually to leave on the 25th of September. And there's an interesting entry in his diary in early September, about the 8th, 9th of September, when he hears that his protege, Raden Saleh, Sharif Bustaman, the family of his, well, he's not an adopted family, he was taken on by his uncle when his father died, into his estate in Torboyo, his house, his residence in Torboyo, brought up there in a very enlightened household. And then when the outbreak of the Java War takes place, his youngest cousin, Radamas Hugur, who is educated in Calcutta, goes over and joins Diponegoro's forces in the shape of Niagang Serang's and Pangeran Serang Kedua's forces around between Demak and Semarang, who cut to pieces a Dutch column under Bushkens on the night of the 2nd, 3rd September. And this leads to the whole of Saleh's family, of that side of Saleh's family, falling under suspicion and eventually being arrested. His stepfather, his adopted father, is put on board a Dutch warship, the frigate Maria Regensbergen, and his eldest first cousin, Radamas Saleh, who had served as Bupati of Lasem, is put on the corvette Pollux, which would later take Diponegoro into exile in Manado, from Batavia to Manado, between the 3rd of May and the 12th of June, 1830. So this is a diary full of surprises, full of insights, written by a very sensitive chronicler, someone who knew Java, did wonderful sketches. He hears from Chevalier about the repression which is going on in the countryside under the situation of the toll gates, the Banda toll, the role of the Chinese, and the very desperate situation which leads to a sort of pogrom, an uprising against the 25,000 Chinese in south-central Java, which accompanies the outbreak of the Java War. So this is, for a historian, a goldmine, socially, economically, in terms of the insights which are given by only the eye of a painter could be able to describe it, the way in which the young sultan is brought back, the 3-year-old sultan from Fredericksburg, into the court, almost at midnight by candlelight, the butchering and the torture of so-called santry, and the tenterhooks in which the Europeans live together, hearing all these rumors and waiting and waiting and waiting until the final relief comes. So, enjoy this. This is a really important and very, very interesting text.
What I write, I saw. I just can't get that phrase out of my head. It's from the journal of an artist named Antoine-Auguste-Joseph Payen, and he's trapped. He's trapped inside the Dutch fort in Yogyakarta in 1825 as the Java War is exploding all around him. And he's not writing about the glory or the defense or the bravery of the soldiers. He's writing about the absolute moral collapse happening inside the walls with his own people. He talks about seeing a senior officer who spends the entire day in a state of complete drunkenness. And then he describes this moment of just unbelievable cruelty. He says, "I saw an officer strike as best as he could one of these men who was said to be a santry. Another was mistreated in the most pitiless manner, trampled underfoot, and was carried away dying." And then he adds the 5 words that just change everything. "What I write, I saw." This is it. This is why we do this. This is why we dig through the archives and piece together the stories. It's for moments like this. Because this isn't just a historical account. This is a testimony. It is the unfiltered, horrified human truth from a man who was not a soldier, not a politician, but an artist, an observer. And his eyewitness account is so powerful, so raw, that it completely shatters the clean, official narrative of war. It shows us that history isn't just made by grand strategies and official declarations. It's made in moments of drunken fury, of callous indifference, of breathtaking brutality, and of shocking, unexpected honor. It is the story of the messy human reality that history books so often try to erase. And what's so incredible, what gives me actual chills, is that Payen saw it all coming. He was the canary in the coal mine. Months before the first shot was fired, he was documenting the signs. Official Dutch reports were probably talking about tax revenues and troop movement. But Payen, the artist, was watching a person. He was watching the Prince Diponegoro. He noted the prince's intense spiritual retreats, this deep meditative practice called the tapa. He saw the open disrespect that Diponegoro showed for the Dutch resident, and he heard the intelligence, the rumors that were flying, that were the prince was using tax money to buy weapons, and that he had already moved his family out of the city and into safety. Payen saw this not as a series of political grievances, but as a human being preparing for a profound, life-altering conflict. From Diponegoro's own writing, we know Payen was dead right. Diponegoro saw himself as the just king, the Ratu Adil, destined to wage a holy war, a Prang Sabil, to cleanse Java of what he saw as the corrupting influence of the Europeans. Payen, he felt the spiritual gravity of it, something that the bureaucrats just couldn't measure. And the bureaucrats, this is where it becomes a tragedy of errors. The final spark of the war wasn't some grand battle or a surprise attack. It was a catastrophic failure of diplomacy, of basic human decency by the Dutch resident, a man named Smissaert. And Payen was right there, watching it unfold. The key to peace was Diponegoro's own uncle, the Prince Mangkubumi, who was desperately trying to mediate peace between the two parties. And how does Smissaert handle this crucial potential ally? Well, Payen wrote that Smissaert treated him harshly and threatened to hold him personally responsible for any trouble. He used, quote, a menacing way, end quote, that had in Payen's devastatingly understated words very disadvantageous consequences for us, the Dutch. You think? You just don't alienate your only bridge to peace. They set it on fire. This threat wasn't just some heated verbal exchange, it was formalized. On July 20th, 1825, a letter was sent to Diponegoro's own. And the official Dutch military history, the other side of our story, confirms that this wasn't a letter of negotiation. It was an ultimatum. It accused Diponegoro of gathering armed men and explicitly stated that these were crimes punishable by death according to Javanese laws. It demanded that he come to the residency to give an account. It was a summon to his own execution. What choice did that leave anyone? Mangkubumi's position was made impossible. He had no choice but to join his nephew. And after that, the Dutch records themselves stated that gatherings of armed men increased visibly. The blunder was complete. Diplomacy was dead. So, of course, the Dutch opted for force. With diplomacy shattered, they sent a column to Diponegoro's residence at Tegalrejo to arrest him. And again, we get this incredible fusion of perspectives. The official military history, the Oorlog of Java, it gives us the cold, hard facts, the order of battle. It's so precise. The commander was First Lieutenant de Thierry. The units were 25 European hussars, 25 European light infantry, 2 field cannons, and here's the part that is often omitted in official histories. They brought their allied of Javanese troops. It's a neat little list, but it's Payen, the artist, who gave us the cinematic, unforgettable image of what happened next. He watched the aftermath from a distance, and he watched with his own eyes the mission failing spectacularly. And he captured the birth of a legend in a single, perfect frame. He wrote, Pangeran Diponegoro was a short distance away, mounted on a beautiful, superbly harnessed black horse. He was dressed in all white, according to the Arab costume. Chevalier and Thierry recognized him and charged at him, but they soon found themselves bogged down in their rice fields and could not reach him. The prince, taking advantage of the path he was on, managed to escape. Can you see that? It's not a military report. It's a painting. the rebel prince, a symbol of purity and defiance in white, on a magnificent black horse, literally outmaneuvering the clumsy, bogged-down European cavalry. He was not just escaping, he's ascending into myth right there before Payen's eyes. And the official history provides the tragic, deeply human postscript to this artistic image. The commander of the failed mission, Lieutenant Decay, overwhelmed by shame and despair of letting the prince escape, took his own life. The war had claimed its first European officer, not in battle, but in failure. And the war began immediately. Diponegoro's call for a holy war spread like fire across the land. The Dutch history records the terrifying clarity of the message. The goal was, quote, to cleanse the native soil of the presence of heathenish oppressors, and that, quote, all who are not Mohammedan must be exterminated. It was total war. And this is where we turn to Payen, trapped in the fort, watching the ugliness unfold, not just outside the walls, but also inside the fort. This is the valley after that peak of action. This is the part that's hard to read, but it's the most important, because Payen's journal becomes a chronicle of moral decay. He is horrified by what he sees among his fellow Europeans. It is not a story of a noble, stoic defense. It is a story of leadership, drowning its fear in alcohol and cruelty. He's living through this brutal siege, and a senior officer spends the whole day drunk. At that moment, that truly reveals the rot at the core is about food. A siege means starvation, and the local Javanese population inside the fort is suffering terribly, including the Sultan's own family. Payen records that when a compassionate officer reported that the Sultan's children were literally begging for food, he wasn't met with concern or a plan. He was mocked. The royal family was insulted with vulgarities. Payen writes about the callous indifference of the leadership. Think about that. In the middle of a fight for their lives, a fight ostensibly to maintain order and their way of life, the leadership reveals a profound lack of humanity. They are not just fighting an enemy, they are poisoning their own souls. And it's the artist, Payen, who is sensitive enough to see it, to feel the weight of it, and to write it down for history. What I write, I saw. He's not just an observer anymore, he's a witness to the persecution against the arrogance and decay of the colonial system that he is part of. And while this moral rot is happening inside the fort, the Dutch are getting decimated on the battlefield. The early days of the war were an absolute disaster for them. In late July, a relief column under the command of Captain Kumsius was ambushed at Pasangan. The rebels didn't just win, they captured the treasury, a fortune of 28,600 florins. The rear guard of that column, a unit of 40 elite light infantrymen under Lieutenant Bohart, was cut off in the rice paddies. They were annihilated. Bohart and 27 of his men were killed. Not much of a setback, it was a full catastrophe. Diponegoro's army wasn't some disorganized mob. He was building a holy army, with elite religious named units and irregular forces he used to harass the Dutch relentlessly. He was even symbolically linking his fight to the wider Islamic world, adopting Turkish military terms for his units and taking titles like Caliph, But then, amidst all this brutality, all this chaos and disillusionment, the historical record gives us this one small perfect moment of pure, unadulterated honor. It's like finding a single perfect flower growing on a scorched battlefield. The Dutch records themselves noted, and coming from them, it carries even more weight. A Javanese cavalry master, loyal to the Dutch, a man named Raden Mas Suwongso, was captured by Diponegoro's forces. He was a prize catch. Diponegoro offered him status, power, a place in the rebellion. He tried to turn him, and Suwongso refused. He looked the leader of this unstoppable holy war in the eye and declared that he would rather die than become a traitor. He chose his oath over his life. And here's the most incredible part. The Dutch historian writes, with what sounds like genuine admiration, that Diponegoro, the man whose followers were told to exterminate all non-believers, respected this man's loyalty. He respected his integrity so much that he released him unharmed. In the middle of a brutal existential war, these two men on opposite sides shared a moment of profound mutual respect for the concept of honor. It's beautiful. And it's a story that would be completely lost, a footnote in the military ledger, if we didn't have the rich human context provided by Payen's observations of all the dishonor happening elsewhere. Eventually, the tide had to turn, at least for a moment. The siege of Yogyakarta was finally broken up on September 20th, 1825. A massive relief column, led by a Colonel Kokis, fought its way to the city. It was a brutal 14-hour running battle just to get there. The siege of Yogyakarta was finally broken on September 20th, 1825. A massive relief column, led by a Colonel Kokis, fought its way to the city. It was a brutal 14-hour running battle just to get there, with a baggage train of 120 horses carrying the three things a siege requires: rice, money, and ammunition. For Payen, you'd think this would be a moment of pure joy, of salvation. But life was never simple, is it? His experience of the war was never clean or triumphant. It was messy and human to the very end. The relief was bittersweet, because the same mail delivery that brought news of their rescue also brought a letter for him. His official post, the reason he was in Java in the first place, had been eliminated due to budget cuts. He survived the war only to be laid off. It's so brutally, tragically real. 2 days later, on September 22nd, he left the city of Yogyakarta. He departed with a military column, leaving the place where he had, in his own words, the finest, the most pleasant, and the most tedious sojourn. And this is the last image he leaves with us, is the final brush stroke from the artist's witness. His journey out of the city wasn't a victory parade. It was a funeral march through a dying land. He wrote grimly, "During our march, we saw several villages burning on our right and our left." That's it. That's where his personal story of the outbreak ends. Looking left and right and seeing nothing but fire. An artist who came to capture the beauty of a new place ends up capturing the horror of its destruction. He saw the human arrogance that lit the match. He painted the iconic picture of the legend who escaped the flames. He chronicled the moral sickness that festered in the sanctuary. And he left us with a final landscape, not of mountains and temples, but of a world engulfed in war. What he wrote, he saw. And thank goodness he did. Because without him, we'd only have the official story. It would have lost the human, horrifying, and beautiful truth. And what about you guys? Reading this, putting it all together, that detail of the callousness of mocking the starving children, that's the one that just broke me. But what was the part that just absolutely got you? Was it the image of Diponegoro's escape? Was it the quiet honor of Raden Mas Suwongso? I need to know. Seriously, share your favorite moments or details that hit you the hardest in the comments. I want to read every single one. And hey, if you're here for deep dives to celebrate the absolute best in history and the power of historical perspective, do all the good YouTube things. Hit that like button and spread the love. Subscribe if you want to join this community, and ring that bell so you don't miss our next perspective. See you next time.